Okay. Can you hear me in the back of the room now, or is it turned on? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't guessed, I'm John M. Lewis. I'm here today. And before I start some remarks, I want to say a couple things. Number one, this is sort of a preamble, I guess you'd call it, a preliminary to the sesquicentennial that's going to happen. I was in the centennial, so it was a very interesting part of Seymour. And I suggested to this lady here, who she's in charge of the old people section, of the history section of the library, that I would give a talk, and I suggested about 3 talks, one every 50 years. Now that sounds a little silly, but yesterday in preparing for this, I do prepare, believe it or not, I figured out that 1 year is 50 years is 18,250 days. Now, I don't know anybody that can put 18,250 days into remarks that's going to last about 30 or 40 minutes if you don't run me out sooner. But I just wanted to mention that. I'm sure I'm going to say things that I shouldn't recall. I'm going to mention some, miss some that I should. But I, very frequently when I make these kind of talks, I say I'm a lucky man. I've had 3 loves in my life. 2 wives, not at the same time. My first wife passed on and the second wife, and the history of Seymour. It's the most fascinating story that I've ever read, and I've done my share of reading. I say you could wake me up in the middle of the night and tell me to tell some stories of Seymour, and I think I'd get up and do it. My effort today will be aimed at something that I don't know that I can achieve, but I want to try to give you an impression of what Seymour was when it was founded and the first 50 years of its life. It's an unusual story. As I say, I don't think it is something that should be forgotten. And that's the reason why I'm inclined to do these things. Now, one reason the library and the lady like me, I'm cheap. I don't charge anything. So it makes it easier on them. But some of you might know, but who can tell me who this is? Oh. Pardon me? It's Meady Shields. You can't tell the story of Seymour without telling something about Meady Shields. And the biggest mistake, I think nowadays, is you can look over Seymour anywhere you want to look, and you won't see a picture of Meady Shields. You won't see a place where he's advertised. If I went to Shields High School and stopped 10 of them and asked who this was, he not being a rap singer, I don't think they would know. And I think that's a tragedy, because the story of Seymour, to me, is the story of what made America great. Now, to give you a preamble to it, Meady Shields came to what is now Seymour area. It wasn't then, of course. In about 1810, with his father. His father had a grant for 1,200 acres of land in and around this area. Now, I never checked it thoroughly to find out why, but 1,200 acres was a big grant, even in those days. Normally, it was part of military action, but when he got the grant, that was before the War of 1812, so it wasn't concerned with that. I'm sorry to say I can't give you too much of the family of Meady Shields, I'm not a genealogist. I never enjoyed working on it that way from that side. The reason is my father told me a long time ago, when I mentioned about some of his ancestors, he said he didn't like it because if they went back too far, they might have found the uncle that was hung for a horse thief. So he wasn't a genealogy person, and I am not either. But it's important to know Meady. He came up here, and as I say, his father had a grant for 1,200 acres. Now, you got to remember, in 1810, the land wasn't like it is now. Jackson County was heavy forested. And one of the reasons they did these grants, homesteaded it, was so that people would clear the land, cut down the trees, and make it profitable land. Meady Shields spent most of his life doing that, and he's given a credit for really developing physically this area. Now, another thing you have to remember to keep this thing in thing, at the time of the beginning of Seymour, of course there was no town here, Rockford was a big place. Sounds strange to us, but it was. Remind you again, in those days, the way you moved around, say you was in Seymour and wanted to go to Madison, you couldn't get a train. You didn't have an automobile. You either walked or rode a horse. That's the only way you could get there. And not everybody owned a horse, so there was a lot of walking. But the waterways were very important. Rockford was a bustling river port. Sounds silly nowadays. I don't know, I think you could get a rowboat to go down White River now, but they did then. They would load up either a flatboat or a raft, put materials on it, corn, wheat, skins, anything they could, and they'd float her all the way down to New Orleans. When they got to New Orleans, they would sell it. Usually they even sold the produce, and they even sold the boat for the wood in it. And then they walked back. Again, no trains or anything else. They had to come home, so they walked. It was estimated that you make 2 round trips a year. When Meady Shields got here and got older, he was given credit for serving as a hand on a couple of those trips. Then he got better than that. He ended up having 2 lines, that's water lines, boats, went down there. That's where he got some of his money. Now, Meady Shields, in my estimation, was one of the first entrepreneurs in southern Indiana, if not Indiana. If you'd have called him that, he wouldn't know what you was talking about. He couldn't have spelled it. And frankly, sometimes I have to look it up. But he was. So bring you up to the starting of Seymour. You got to remember that shortly before this time, the J&I Railroad, the North and South Railroad, was finally finished and went through Seymour going south. And I call it the J&I, it was the Jeffersonville in Indiana, but I'll probably refer to it as the Pennsylvania Railroad because that's what I remember it as. That's the tracks of it anyway. It went through Seymour, and then word was put out, rather informally, that the O&M Railroad was going to come through to pick up the east-west traffic. Now the railroad, O&M, was Ohio and Mississippi. Now how Mississippi got in the name, I don't know, because the railroad I don't think ever touched in Mississippi, but it was the O&M. To me, that's the B&O, so if I say B&O, you'll know that. Well, the railroad, in coming in, asked Rockford, meaning its merchants and people, for a little assistance financially. That's been going on ever since the beginning of time. And people in Rockford and the merchants, thinking that there wasn't any other way for it to go, were a little dilatory. They didn't say no to the railroad, but they didn't say yes. They was hopeful of making a better deal. Meady Shields found out about this, and on his own went to the railroad, the O&M, and he suggested if he would come through his land, he would do three things. Number one, he would build the fill at his own expense west of Seymour. If you want to see it, go down to Poplar Street. Picture of it over here. Okay. Go down to Poplar Street and you can see it. It runs all the way down almost to Hangman's Crossing. Building it at his own expense. Number two, he would give the railroad the right land on both sides of the right-of-way for what they wanted to do with it. The reason for that, again, was that's the way the railroad made the money. Building a railroad is not a cheap thing, even in 1810. But the prize is number three. He told the chief engineer that if he would bring the railroad through, not Seymour, but through his farm, remember it isn't his Seymour yet, he would plat a town and name it Seymour. Now, I've never heard of a man in my life or in history that ever turned down a chance to have a town named after him. So Seymour, who was the head construction engineer of the railroad at that time, agreed to it. Well, you can imagine what Rockford said, and I can't use some of the language that they probably used. But here's one of the pictures. It'll be laying over here for you to look at. It's been passed around. It's rather a rarity now. It's a picture, and his name is not anybody else but Charles Seymour is his name. He's an Englishman that came over here early, and he was supposed to be really a genius in the construction of railroads. So that's how Seymour got its name. Now this happened before the early part of 1952. So Meady had to come along and plat, and he did. He platted the first plat of Seymour, actually on April the 27th, 52. He and his wife platted it. There's pictures, not pictures, there's plats of it. Believe it or not, I found it in the recorder's office of Jackson County. And it's interesting to think of the first plat. It designates as this, beginning at the intersection of the two railroads, and they didn't, the ones that I had mentioned, thence north along Pennsylvania Railroad, that's my interpretation, to 5th Street, then east to Broadway, then south to the railroad. It contained 10 blocks and 100 lots, and that's where Seymour got its start. The first sale of the lots was on November the 11th, 1952. And believe it or not, a guy bought the first one, was from the Tampico area. I'm trying to think of his name. I've got it here, but I don't have it right in front of me. Who? Yes, he constructed the first house in Seymour on the east side of the Pennsylvania Railroad between 4th and 5th Street. The house is still there. It is now the Red Cross thing. That's one of the few that's still there. Later on that year, 12/21/52, the post office established the authority of a postal station in Seymour. That was U.S. Congress did that. Now, I never knew that Congress actually gave credit to the post office, but they did. Naturally, they named Meady W. Shields as the first postmaster. Now, the other gentleman is thought and advertised as being the first postmaster of Seymour. He isn't legally, because he was named by the U.S. Congress. Meady was. What probably happened, and I will give you this for what you want to think of it, Meady W. Shields didn't have the time to be the postmaster, and he probably turned it over to the other man, which is all right. Now, with this decision to bring the railroad through Seymour rather than Rockford. The Rockford, in their remorse, convinced the other railroad, the J&I, not to stop at Seymour, where the Seymour was founded. They said their stop was 2 miles north in Farmington, which was a little community, was 2 miles south, and to have 3 stations within 2 miles of each other was kind of silly. For reasons unclear to me, they bought that, so to speak, and the J&I, for up to 2 years, never stopped in Seymour. It stopped in north, south, but never in Seymour. And the interesting part of that I'll mention to you in just a minute or two, but there's something else I want to mention first. The first railroad train of the B&O came through Seymour, and it was a town then, but it wasn't very big. It was platted at least, June the 29th of 1954. This train was the inaugural train, crossed the intersection. It was a big time in Seymour. The ladies of the town prepared a free lunch, made quite a carnival act of it. Unfortunately, as a part of the observance of the train coming through, they had a flat car with a cannon on it, which was supposed to fire a volley. For reasons unknown, it blew up. 2 of the 6 on board were killed. The other 4 were really badly crippled. But it didn't stop the festivities of the bringing the railroad in. Now, the reason why I said something about what happened, later on, Meade, who was then a member of the legislature of the state of Indiana, he wasn't a dumb one, he was smart. He got a law passed that took care of the stopping. Those of you that are interested, it's Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1857. It's introduced by Meade W. Shields. It was enacted February 27th, 57. And what it provided was, any train that didn't come to a full stop before crossing another train's tracks could be fined, the engineer could be fined not less than $100 nor more than $1,000, and jail time and not less than 3 months nor more than 1 year. Well, now, as you expect, no engineer was going to disregard that. The $1,000 would be awful, and the 3 months that he'd have to serve would be awful. So that's the way Mr. Shields got the train to stop in Seymour. Plus the fact that it shows again he was a little bit smarter than the local boys, and he took care of it. Now the next step in the story, the plat, incidentally, was filed, as I said, April the 27th of 52. Now, the first step in making Seymour a community, shall we say, there was a petition to the county commissioners to be incorporated. That was in 1962. I'm sorry, 1862, beg your pardon. Okay. And it was defeated for some reason on election. There's nothing in history says why, but in 64, the second petition was filed, and it was accepted almost unanimously. Now, there's a big problem with all this. What's the birthday of the town? It's hard to figure out. It isn't like birthday of a human that happens at a certain time and a certain event, but you can't say that about this. Some people, historians, like me, I mean amateur historians, date it from the day that the plat was in. Others of the day that incorporated. And You take your choice. I won't tell you when it was birthday, but I'll tell you it was in 1852. That I'll guarantee you. You could argue if you wanted to on for a date. That's why I won't do it. The first mayor was George Green. First election. I never heard of the name before this, but it was a very important job with the new town. The next important thing was a marshal. The marshal was an important officer then. Remember, he was in the entire police department, unless he had some deputies. And he had his hands full, as we'll relate a little later. George Slagle. If you wanted, you let me know. I can give you the full list. I've got it, but I'm not trying to give you it to you start with. Now, one of the prides of Seymour, to me at least, is its growth. Now, they didn't have, it wasn't around in the census of 1850, but it was around in the 1860, and the number at that time was 1,553 residents. In 1870, it jumped to 2,372. 1880, it was 4,240. 1890, it was 5,337. And 1900 was 6,445. That is a growth from zero in those years to that. That's a tremendous endorsement. I wanted to mention that so that you'd have it. Now we're going to get into some other parts, but I want to give you some of the first. People have enjoy that. The first general store, who opened it? B.D.W. Shields and his brother-in-law. It was at 2nd and Indianapolis Avenue. The first public house, is what they call it, instead of a hotel, was Thomas McCullum. He come along in the same year. It's interesting to note that he built the place to eat first, then he added 2 wings. One wing was for a saloon, which was a necessity in those days, it seemed like, by the number we had. And number 3, he lived in the second wing. He was, the first merchant was Henry A. Wools, 4th and Indianapolis Avenue. As I read this list, you will note most of them was along Indianapolis Avenue. Now, it was along the train tracks. It was there because that's where the town activity was. 2nd Street was there, but nobody lived on 2nd Street to start with. They went to Broadway, nobody lived there. The people, the business places were on Indianapolis Avenue. The first new resident built in Seymour was by Dr. John T. Shields, a relation of me, I don't know how close, and it was, of course, in Indianapolis. The first lawyer was Sam Smith. I put that in because I have to give him mention. I don't know a thing in the world about him, but I have to tell you about it because I've been doing that for a couple of days myself. The first JP was Lee A. Osborne. Now that sounds, we don't think much of JPs now, justice of peace, to you uninitiated. But it was important then because that was practically the sole law place in that area. Now the first church, B.D. Shields wasn't really a benefactor, but he was a smart man. He put advertisements, allegedly, in Cincinnati, Louisville, and other papers, that he would give $100 and a free lot to a church that would be established in Seymour. The first church established in 1855. What is it? Huh? I'm sorry?
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian is right. There's a church that celebrated the centennial not too long ago, and I don't know where they got the date, but if it was, actually, officially, it was a Presbyterian society. That was the first church. Their first building was at the corner where the Seymour National Bank was. They sold the lot, probably made a profit because it didn't cost them anything. They moved to their present location, and that's where they built the first church. That's the church that is there now. But that's interesting because, as I say, you can get in some rather serious discussion with some people about some of these dates. That's why I'm very lenient with them. I make it a point to tell you in honesty that I don't say something I can't back up, but a lot of times it isn't that able to give you a real thing. Now, Catholic Church, the reason I throw this in, Catholic Church and school come along in '58, 3 years later, and they built across the street from the present one. And it cost them $690. That's what the whole it cost. Now, Seymour is founded. Some of the activities of Seymour. One that tickles me at least. The city council, June the 30th, 1890, passed an ordinance that all saloons had to close on Sunday. That's the first blue law that I've personally had any knowledge of. And I bet there's a lot of weeping and wailing when it's closed them on Sunday because the boys on Saturday didn't get enough, but that's beside the point. The one that I personally enjoy mentioning is the Majestic Theater, 1890. The Inn Hotel in July '83. It was a big hotel. It was a necessary hotel. You don't understand. You've got to stop and think how they work. Drummers, as they called them, came into Seymour on train. They stopped at the Lynn Hotel. They go to the livery stable and get buggy, wagon, whatever they wanted, and they made their rounds all around Seymour. They might stay in Seymour for a week. They'd make their rounds, take the orders, and they'd come back to Seymour with the orders, or the orders would come back. They'd leave Seymour, maybe go to North Vernon. This is later on. But the Seymour Lynn Hotel was one of the hubs of activity and important to the life of Seymour. The first newspaper was the Rockford Herald, moved in June '57, and it was named as the Seymour Times. So it was the first Seymour newspaper. It was the Seymour Times. I don't know how many of you know it, but we're fortunate right now in this town in that this library has on, I don't know what they call them now. I used to call them tapes, but they don't call them that. What do you call them? Where is she? She left me? What do we call them now? See, microfilm. That's beyond. This microfilm, and that's where you can get the history. 90% of what I'm telling you is from one of those pages. Of course, if you sit there and look at it long enough, you lose some eyesight, but it's still there. All right. Shields High School, Shields School. Let's start out with school because I don't want to say high school yet. Shields School was built because of a $15,000 bond made by sold by the city of Seymour. And they built it to have all 12 grades going there. It a little surprised me. This was earlier, but in '74, Seymour High School then, or Shields High School, got its first class commission and graduated the first class. This is one that I get a big kick out of. When I say get a big kick out of it, it's kind of silly. It isn't really important to the growth of Seymour. But they're reading the city ordinances. They passed an ordinance to the general effect telling the school authorities that they had to move the privy from along 6th Street because of the odor. Now you stop and think about that just for a minute when I say this. How'd you like to be going to Shields High School back in those days on December the 13th when the snow was 3 feet on the ground and it was 18 below zero, and you're in the building attending school and you've got to go out to Chick Sale's monument? That's what I say. I get a perverse kick out of that. It just tickles me to death because if nothing else, we've improved past that. Now, there's two things that you have to take in consideration in the growth of Seymour. Remember, it was during the Civil War years, 52 now, and take your Civil War years. Southern Indiana was a hotbed of confusion about the Civil War. You have to remember, too, that 90% of the people that came from other countries came from the South, and they settled in Seymour. They were the natives. Then their children and so forth increased the population. Believe it or not, the initial cause of the confusion, and there was public meetings where voices were raised in anger and a few other odds and ends, and a little physical chastisement if you said the wrong thing sitting next to the wrong fellow. But the big thing was whether the right of the state to succeed. The argument was by the South and those favoring the South that they joined by their own agreement, so they had the right to leave by their own agreement. Now, there wasn't a thing in there about emancipation in the early stages. Seymour was as confused as the rest of them. But when they fired on Fort Sumter, it's in the history books, and it's in the books of quite a few historians, that Seymour, then, which was moving along a little bit, changed abruptly. Patriotism flowed freely. They were generally for the North. And Seymour, in some books that I have read, is kind of a pearl in that it was in favor of the North in the Civil War. But there's one part of the Civil War that comes in that makes it a little hard. During the Civil War, near the end of the Civil War, Seymour was known throughout the whole countryside, and I mean that literally from coast to coast and border to border, as the most lawless place in the United States. And it's been documented. There isn't any question about that. I read an editorial in the Seymour Times not too long ago through the microfilm that there was 58 murders in the town in 1 week. Now, why? Here's where it was. You've got to remember another thing. If you lived in the South and wanted to go east, you couldn't walk it, you couldn't drive it, you couldn't ride a horse hardly that. You got a train and you come to Seymour. That wasn't in your plans. You just come to Seymour because that's where you intersected with the East-West Railroad. And then you went east if you was going east, and then you went west. That was the only way to get there. Well, some people who I'm going to mention a little more fully later, in a minute or two, they were Johnny on the spot. It is said, and it's been substantiated again, if you stayed overnight in the Raider house, and that is quite a name for this community, if you stayed all night in the Raider house, you woke up next morning dead with your throat cut. Now, have any of you seen Rage at Dawn movie? It's a movie about Seymour, believe it or not. Randolph Scott is the star. It's a Western. It's got some of the most beautiful scenery I ever saw. And if it's anything like anything around Seymour, they sure hit it for me because I haven't seen it. But he had it. There was a big film. It was a pretty good Western if you like Westerns. I've got it, and if you can get it, I would tell you you'll enjoy it. Don't take it for history, take it for movie, but it's a beautiful story. What it was is claimed, a lot of the soldiers, when they were discharged at the end of the Civil War, would come on the train, O&M, no, J&I, they'd come on that train and stop at Seymour. And of course, the first thing they probably did was went to the bar. And if they flashed bills of any quantity in the bar, they was the ones that was murdered. It was very casual-like. I mean, it wasn't too much thing. They did it frequently. And that's where we got the name. Going to the, I'm trying to get the date here because I want to tell you, right after the Civil War, let's put it that way, the newspapers picked it up, and they picked it up worldwide, that the vigilantes ought to take care of it. And that's one of the few times that you'll read in the local newspaper when they call on the people to organize the vigilantes. But they thought it was highly needed. And Seymour got through that. Now the next one, which is probably more popular with most people, we had some bad boys around here. They're famous worldwide, the Reno Brothers. And they have a part in the growth of Seymour, or the lack of growth, whichever way you want to take it. They were very active. It is said, this is substantiated, that Frank enlisted for 3 years in the Northern Forces and served honorably and was discharged. John, who was the oldest, enlisted for 2 years, served 1 year, and became a deserter. It's an interesting aspect of the family that John was the oldest, Frank was the oldest, but John was the leader of the bunch. Now, I've spoke before on the Renos, and I'm not going to go into all of it now because that's a story in itself. But they turned Seymour into the worst. But what happened to cause the real consternation, there's 4 train robberies. Seymour still, if you want to argue it, I can prove it to you, is the site of the first train robbery in the world. If you want to know where it happened almost behind where the state police post is now. That was outside of Seymour town, but that was about where it happened. In that one, there was minimum money. But if one happened to others, there was about $100,000 taken. And you got to understand something else about the railroads. Number one, in 1849, gold was found in California, as you've all heard many times. Now that gold had to get to the east, mostly. The big banks in New York, Washington, Baltimore, and all those. And it came by train, because again, that's the only way to do it. You couldn't put 100 pounds of gold on a horse and try to send him to, ride him to New York, because you had to cross the Mississippi River at least, and that might be a little rough on the horse carrying 100 pounds of gold. But there was 2 safes in every train. One of them what they called the local safe, and the other was a through safe. The local safe is one that the man in charge, the clerk, had a key to. He didn't have a key to the one through. So they concentrated on taking the safe and the money in it. The Renos were bad, but they were good in one respect. They never bothered the passengers. All they were after was the gold in the train. Now, one of the main reasons they didn't bother the passengers is because in those days, about every man carried a gun. And how would you like to go in and try to hold up a coach with 40 men in it, each one of them with a gun, and say you're under arrest or we're robbing you? It wouldn't be very popular. You wouldn't live too long, see. So they didn't do it. Now, the fourth one was the one that caused all the consternation. And it ended up that 3 of the Renos went to Canada. John was in jail in, where was it? Not farther west. And they were indicted. Well, they wanted extradition from Canada. And Queen Victoria, remembering for you that she was Queen of England, and Canada was a part of England in those days, at least government-wise, and she wanted some assurance that the ones that were in Canada wouldn't be lynched. So there was quite a bit of negotiation and high levels of diplomatic levels. And finally, the writ of extradition was granted, and the three that were in Canada were returned first to Scottsburg and then taken down to New Albany. They were taken to New Albany to be in jail because it's supposed to be the best jail in the state of Indiana, in that one was 5 bricks thick with steel and so forth. Well, the vigilantes took care of it. The story of that is the story in itself. A certain night, the date is immaterial, there was a coach parked on the side of the railroad going south, curtains drawn, nothing indicating what happened. When the night train came through, it picked up that coach and took it to Jeffersonville. Inside that coach was about 50 of the vigilantes. There's no publicity in the papers about it or anything else, and who they were has never been acknowledged. Anyway, they got off at Jeffersonville, commandeered an engine, went to New Albany, and lynched the 3 Renos in the jail. They came back, the car was picked up again, brought back to Seymour, and they got out. Now that caused an international problem, very high-level discussions, because the Queen had granted the extradition because of the endorsement of what they would protect them. The governor of Indiana at that time, who I won't name, was rather smart. He said that he guaranteed the protection of the 3 Renos as long as they was under his jurisdiction. But when they put them in the New Albany jail, he didn't have anything to do with taking care of them or anything else. So he wiggled out of it. But there was a period of time that the name of Seymour, Indiana, was known throughout the world as violating the laws of extradition, insulting the Queen of England, and according to where you live, so forth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I spoke longer than I had in mind. I'm not going to, let me check a couple things, and I'm about ready to quit. But I want to say that I think, maybe I'm too impressed, I think we should never forget the history of this town. Just remember one thing. A poor man came in here, poor boy, start with, came in here, and he settled in this area. Another thing, I'd like to know the story of this. I've never been able to read it. He married the belle of Brownstown, far as society is concerned. She was a Ewing. How they ever got together would be a good story, and I managed to make a good book, but I've never read it. By work, first on the boats to New Orleans, and then by developing the farm from his father, he literally pulled himself up by the bootstraps, which proves again that if you work hard enough, you can attain goals that absolute. That's why I don't think he should be forgotten. Without him, I'm not going to say there wasn't any possibility there'd be a town here named maybe Seymour or something else, but we might have been a suburb of Rockford, because Rockford was a big town. I don't think that would be too bad, but every time I go across the Rockford Bridge, I try to visualize going down that river. And I don't think you could go down that river. How far could you get? Could you get to Brownstown on the darn thing if you was in a boat? I don't think you could, but just think of them going all the way down to New Orleans. Now, I've been to New Orleans. That's a good place to be. Nice town, but I'd hate to go down by boat, particularly over the river here now. As I say, I haven't covered everything. I don't think there's any way in the world I could cover everything. I will say, if you've got a question, I'll try to answer it. If I can't answer it, oh, I want to say something here. I don't think too many of you have seen this. It'll be laying over here. You can't take it with you, but can you look at it? This is a proclamation by the Vigilance Committee to the people of the United States. After they were lynched in New Albany, they come up and posted this all over the city of Seymour at that time. And it's a warning. Outside of some rather fancy language, Latin and so forth, you want to read this second part. We are well aware that at the present time a combination of the few remaining thieves, their friends and sympathizers, have been formed against us and have threatened all kind of vengeance against persons who they suppose to belong to this organization. Some more of it. But here's what I think is so popular. The following named persons are solemnly warned that their designs and opinions are known, and then they cannot, unknown to us, make a move towards retaliation. Then they name them. I'm not going to read them all. There's Renos and everybody else. If the above named individuals desire to remain in our midst to pursue honest callings, honest callings and otherwise conduct themselves as law-abiding citizens, we will protect them always. If, however, they commence their devilish designs against us, our property, or any good citizen in this district, we will rise, but once more, do not trifle with us. If you do, we will follow you to the bitter end and give you a short shrift and a hempen collar. Now, if you remember the Reno gang and you walked out of your door in the morning and saw that posted on a tree, I don't think you'd hang around. That supposedly is what cleaned it up. Now, a lot of people have told me many times that I shouldn't talk too much about the Renos. I've always disagreed with that. They say it makes Seymour look bad. I think it makes Seymour look good, because the people living there then finally took it in their own hands and cleaned the town up, and it stayed relatively clean ever since. I've known different politicians in the past would claim something different to that parts of Seymour, but they can't make it stick. Now, as I say, I'm going to quit. I look at that clock back there and I think it's going to explode in a minute. Anybody got any questions? I'll try to answer. If I can't answer it offhand, if you give me a name, I'll send you an answer. Okay, why don't you make the drawing? Where'd she go? Is she back there again? Oh, she's over on the other side. She moves on me.
John, was the Seymour called Mule Cross?
Yeah, well, now that's the point. One of the things that Meady Shields was famous for, he was a mule, well, what do you call them? You couldn't call raised a lot of mules, that's the way to put it. And they called Seymour derisively the mule crossing, because if you got down close to his farm, you had, hundreds of mules. And now that's the way it's said. I don't know how many mules you can raise at once, but that was there. Okay, I don't question your statement. Yeah.
What's interesting to me, in order to get the railroad to come through here, first of all, he contracted to make this huge field from here out to Hangman Crossing you're talking about. And he furnished the mules and the labor and everything else and paid for it.
Yeah.
Where did they get all that field material? There's a lot of
I have no idea. Now you're out of my field. But I know, but remember this. An automobile can go down, or a truck or anything, it can go down, even a horse and buggy, up and down like this, but trains don't. That's why it's level, and that's why that fill's there. And the beautiful part about it, that fill was put in 1852. Of course, it's been maintained, but it's the same fill that was put in back here then. Any more? Go ahead. They're not real valuable, but there's something. Whoop! That's the first one. Why don't you? That's the first one. Bill Pollard. Come on up here. Give me one. Come on, you get something. It didn't. Now you're not going to be able to take this to Jackson County Bank and sell it for $1,000. But there's a pictorial history of Seymour. Here, Bill, come here. You come here and draw one. Go ahead. Wilma Burge. Wilma. Well, send somebody up to get it. I won't deliver it to you. Well, if she will. What they are is what is called the pictorial history of Seymour, as developed with me at one time. No, I don't. Draw one. Ruby Austin. Here, I'll get one. Draw one right here on the, oh, my legs are getting out. One on the first row. If you get your own name, it's all right with me. Sue Brown. One more, isn't it? Well, but take it out of there. Here, you look like you're a good drawer.
I'll never draw my own.
What, it's all right with me. Walt Abel. Now,
I get to read it now.
all right, now, this other one, the main prize is not very costly, but when I was writing for the Tribune, there was 8 put out. There's the 6 left. Number 3 and 4 are out of print. I don't know how you'd ever get one, but there's 6 of the pictorials, so you've got 3/4. That's make 3/4 of a set. How you get the other 2, I ain't going to ask you, but that is the big one. You couldn't buy that because it isn't for sale. Now I need a drawer. Here, you look like you are. Shirley Pottsmith. Now I'll listen to some questions if you got them. If you don't have them, I thank you. It's been a pleasure for me, and I hope you enjoyed it at least about a half as much as I do, because I enjoy doing this. Okay, no, that's all. Don't do that too long, might start again. You know, being a lawyer, you like to talk, and it's always nice when you got somebody to listen.